Okay, so today we will look at the Borromean Knot and the linking of three fundamental psychic registers, being imaginary, symbolic, and the real. We have already looked at the genesis of two of these registers. Well, actually, we looked at the registers of three of them, but we looked in detail at the imaginary and the symbolic. So subjectivity starts with the fundamental encounter with the real, whereby the portion of the drive is expelled. Yeah. That which is expelled remains, well, repressed in primal repression and then rendered linguistically through signifiers which point to it in a secondary repression. However, what has been expelled is always already forever lost. It only comes back as the anxiety, as the lingering presence of traumatic jouissance, and as fear, displeasure in the body. So that's real. And in the threefoil knot of rings, the real is here, represented by the blue ring. The real. In response to initial expulsion, psyche starts to be constructed, first through acquisition of the desire and the image from the other, then through the acquisition of language. That which pertains to the other, the first other, the pleasurable plethora of bodily intensities which are organized in the sense of totality via mirrored image of the other, pertains to imaginary. Remember also that when we talk about these registers, as well as anything, they are representations. However, the purpose of this schematization is to bypass the imaginary precisely, because this dyadic logic pertaining to the imaginary and to the paranoid knowledge which it engenders is precisely what is reductionistic. Because when we think in dualistic concepts and create mental images about them, this becomes unhelpful because it reduces complex issues into simplistic problems. This comes down to imaginarization of psychic contents, and systems that do that tend to not go very far, in my opinion, like classifying archetypes or whatever, magical thinking. It all pertains to certain imagery that's being built behind the concepts which try to describe the psyche. We are still stuck at this level, at the level of paranoid knowledge, if we do this. So mathematical or schematic representation of phenomena which are complex is more conducive to being less biased, one would say. Of course, it's still not direct knowing and understanding. That would imply that one have bypassed the whole structuration, or, well, transcended it. But it gives us somewhat more of a sober, I would say, outlook into things and their complexity. So that precisely pertains to the symbolization, yeah, and this stands for the symbolic. So, as like I said, we already looked at the imaginary registers, how it forms. If you want to revisit that, come back to the lecture on the mirror stage. And we have already looked at how symbolic comes into being. For that, come back to a lecture on the structure of the subject, or sorry, for the subject of the unconscious. This is structure of the subject, in Lacanian terms at least. In this structure, we have the Borromean Knot, which comes from the emblem of this family of Borromeo, which has these three rings overlaying on top of each other. This ring lies on top of this ring, whereas this ring lies on top of first ring, yet underneath the second ring. Yeah. So they are intertwined in this way. Removing one ring will result in disconnection and disjoinment of the rings. And this is precisely what happens on the level of psychic apparatus if some of these links, well, don't really exist, one would say. So remember when we looked at the Oedipus complex and the Oedipal narrative, formation of the subject, I mentioned that if triangulation between the first and second other and the child doesn't happen, that leads to fusion type subjectivity or psychotic subjectivity. In this sense, you might say that the imaginary register hasn't quite formed as yet, because the fusion still exists and the subject is still on sort of pre-subjective level, and the symbolic hasn't come to separate that which hasn't even formed from the real of the fusion. Hence, the subject is always threat of invasion, under the threat of invasion of jouissance, which in psychotic break comes in forms of hallucinations and somatic delusions. So we can say that in that case, the knot is undone, or registers kind of mesh into each other, they float into each other. They are not clearly delineated. It is not clearly understood, because one would say that the S1, the master signifier, has not entered the picture, and that's ultimately the name of the father, yeah? As we looked in the subject to the unconscious. It hasn't taken the central stage in the symbolic. So when this master signifier is absent, symbolic is not structured, it's kind of undone. And in such a way it cannot bind the imaginary, cannot clearly delineate, pinpoint, remember the quilting point, to quilt the proliferation of meaning around psychophysical experiences. If that doesn't happen, well, the subject is having difficulty with accessing language. So, well, in this case, something else can be done, and we'll come back to that. This relates to the symptoms, basically. So, what is engendered by the imaginary is a certain consistency. Yeah, the specular image taken in from the other and incorporated, thereby structuring the fragmentation which pertains to the real body, creates some sort of consistency, continuity of the subjective experience or psychic experience. Sense of I, the ego, ideal ego, is sort of congruent. It is whole, albeit illusory whole, but it gives us the capacity to experience this. There's this reality, which in psychoanalytic theory we only speak about psychic reality and not the material reality. Experience this reality as some kind of continuity. Whereas symbolic introduces the gap in the continuity by precisely introduction of this, the name of the father, master signifier. This may be something I haven't mentioned, but the nature of master signifier is nonsensical. As such, it points to area of emptiness within the psyche, area of non-meaningful. Why? Well, because of the initial prohibition, remember, non and nom, prohibition and name of the father, which are nonsensical. You cannot do that, cannot have affectionate fusion with your mother, because I said so. What's the reason? Who cares? I said so. Just no. Why? Who cares? But the point is that this nonsensical dimension of master signifier creates the capacity for meaning to be produced and to be quilted or pinpointed within the whole of the symbolic, if that is absent, sense or meaning proliferates. And this is what we find in psychotic or fusion type subjectivities, or when neurotic subjectivity collapses onto non-meaningful, in case of the foreshadowing of the name of the father. So another area from which Lacan took the concept of the name of the father, or the master signifier, is from the set theory, whereby the missing element in the set produces the condition for the whole set to exist. And that's precisely what the name of the father does. It creates the capacity for meaning in the symbolic by introducing negativity. Paternal prohibition and law is something that introduces negativity. And as such, it introduces, of course, lack. Remember, in psychotic subjectivity, there is lack of luck. It hasn't been yet introduced because name of the father is foreclosed. So we can say then that this here knot is the knot which exists in neurotic subjectivity. In psychotic subjectivity, it would be like rings enmeshed with one another. And Lacan tried to symbolize it in seminar 23 on the synthome, whereby he would be drawing links which are tangled with one another. And this is the case in the subjectivity, which is arguably actually most common in neurotic. Psychotic and things like ordinary psychosis are quite common. Yeah, it is often that the master signifier, or a certain area of emptiness, certain area of lack, is not introduced. The subjects remain entrapped in this whole illusory sense of, illusory sense of wholeness, omnipotence, and possibility of endless satisfaction, which of course produces the invasions of traumatic jouissance. What lack does, it shelters one from the excess of jouissance by following jouissance on the inverted ladder of the law of desire. Neurotic subject can spare oneself sort of tumult and turmoil of psychic suffering, which psychotic break ultimately illustrates. But none of these subjectivities are superior to each other. They are simply the way psychic reality is structured, or the ways in which psychic reality is structured. So whereas the imaginary, what says for consistency, the symbolic, which says for gap, and this is that, yeah. Master signifier latches onto non-meaningful, creating the condition for meaning to be produced in the whole of the symbolic. The real, in turn, stands for that which is existent or extimate. That intimate exteriority which pertains to that which has been expelled. It is always already expelled. There is no return of it. There is only abiding into it. And we'll look today more directly into, or more in detail, how real can be classified in a way. Symbolic introduces the gap only because imaginary has a tendency to build consistent images of the real. This is imaginarization of the real. Hence, the gap can be introduced to say that this imaginarization is fictitious. Yeah? Hence, the gap. When it's fictitious, when we can explain the theory as to why it is so, and thereby language incorporates a little bit of the real. So we say that language eats the real. Or Lacan says, language is the real. Each fictitious imaginarization, which symbolization latches onto, thus somehow consumes a little bit of the real. And remember, through that object A, part of the drive, part of jouissance, induces the symbolic register with carnality and vitality of the drive. So that's how kind of human becoming qua language and qua symbolization of that which ultimately is not symbolizable since it's extimate unfolds. Yeah. Another area by which symbolic is engendered by real is what Lacan calls Lacan. We can say this, Lacan, or LL, language. Such a form of appropriation of symbolic whereby jouissance is latching onto words. Jouissance latching onto words or signifiers, which are different, by the way. Here, a portion of the drive is transposed onto the signifiers, which induces them with certain vitality and potency, which is, of course, nonsensical, because for the imaginary meaning making, by the way, imaginary always seeks for meaning, symbolic doesn't seek for meaning, it seeks for structure. Maybe I should delineate it. Meaning. Whereas in symbolic there is structure. Structure. In light of meaningfulness, this would be meaningless, the latching on the libido of jouissance on the words. And in light of real, there will be relieving. There will be vitality kind of imbued into words, and one can well, sort of embody part of the drive into one's articulations. Hence we have phenomena in psychosis whereby psychotic would be playing with words or producing what Lacan called ejaculatory speech, just kind of like spitting out the bits and pieces of libido, enunciated, imbued with carnality and drive speech, which is nonsensical, more often than not. So this is how the real enters the symbolic, and symbolic binds the imaginary. How then real engenders the meaning is, well, meaninglessness. And this is how master signifier can be kind of alluding to the real, because it introduces negativity which pertains to that which has been expelled. This is why master signifier has this characteristic of nonsensical. Why? Well, because precisely alludes to the real of many things. Dukkha and the drive and jouissance and lack and anxiety and death are ultimately only manifestations therein. We'll look into more as to how real can be represented. But yes, okay, so this is how psyche kind of bound together, well, in a neurotic sense. In a neurotic sense, we can say again that the presence of the Oedipal narrative, through the triangulation and introduction of the name of the father, creates psychic reality. Yeah. It creates the belief that the images built around the events, because events are real, that all these images built around the events follow a certain logic. Logic, domain of the structural symbolic, you would say this is, well, of course, images. And this is events, but not your everyday events, particular events whereby one encounters the limit one's symbolization and imaginarization, encounters the drive, encounters death, encounters impossibility, encounters luck. These are called events. Other than that, a trivia. Logic. So that's neurotic belief. Let's write it down somewhere. Neurotic belief. Of course, it's not a belief in the sense of something chosen. No, neurotic. It's a structural category more than anything. Neurotic belief is that images are adequate. Oh, sorry. Images of events follow logic. There's the neurotic belief that images around the events follow certain logic. Here we can say that the Borromean links or rings are structured into the knot. A knot can be found here. This here area is a trefoil knot. There. A trefoil knot, which, well, if you want to draw it as a knot, that would make sense to do it like this. Yeah. We have knotting. Knotting of the three registers. Okay. So this here is actually the Borromean knot, which is built via intersection of Borromean rings. The knot pertains to that which, in neurotic sense, we would call psychic reality or symptom. So believe that images built around events follow a certain logic creates psychic reality or a certain symptom. Remember, lack of symptom pertains to identification with on the level of the imaginary, or precluding the imaginary. A state of fusion whereby the body is completely whole, toy, and one jubilating libidinal entity. But that's of course imaginary body, isn't it? The real body, the lack, the gap is always introduced, engendered by the contingency of the drive. And, well, precisely because registers are interlinked, symptom is produced on the level of the knot. Because symptom is produced, one can speak about some sort of psychic reality in a congruent sense, not in a sense of just imaginary bubble, or not in the sense of continuous invasions of jouissance. Neither in a sense of utter and complete symbolization of everything. That would be the case for obsessional neurosis or psychotic delusion metaphor. Maybe it's worth looking at what happens prior to symbolization. Remember when we looked at introduction of object A, it is that which is left after the real of the drive has been rendered through language and through image. One must say that symbolic and imaginary arise simultaneously to a certain extent. a subject is already born into symbolic net, world, accustomed to the symbolic net, built around everything. As soon as subject is born, it's already born into a family which is history, is already given a name, already symbolized, labeled, if you like, by something. And that already starts structuring that particular bubble of imaginary totality which one will identify with to form ideal ego. And symbolic will then continue to proliferate around that, but it was there before that as well. So we speak about symbolic imaginary which latches onto the real of the drive, thus making it bearable. So hence we can make a division between two areas of symptoms, or how symptoms may manifest. They can either manifest before or be pertaining to that which was precluding the moment of linguistic rendering of the drive, or after. So that which pertains to before symbolization we would call as actual pathology, whereas that which has followed symbolization we would call psychopathology. The difference is crucial because at this level there is not yet linguistic rendering. Phenomena appear real. The anxiety is real. Freud has started with formulating the category of actual neurosis. And that category kind of has been forgotten since Freud, because everybody now looks into how the knot is noted and how the language has already processed phenomena. But that persists because never, remember from previous lectures, never all of the real can be fully captured by imaginary and symbolic. It is always the estimate remainder, or reminder, which is what object A engenders. Hence, a portion of the real always remains contingent, always remains traumatic. So contingency and trauma is located on this area. Remember, the very first eruption of jouissance pertaining to the real is traumatic. This is the structural foundational trauma in response to which the entirety of the subjectivity is structured. So that's why we say in Lacanian psychoanalytic theory that there is no initial state of being perfect. It just didn't exist. It all originated from the discord, inchoate chaos of intensities, in response to which the sense of perfection is then structured in the imaginary. It is only via acquisition of the image of the other during mirror stage for a short split moment where it's jubilant and maybe last couple of years, I don't know, while child is sheltered and protected within the familial framework and all the phenomena incorporated satisfy and sustain its ideal ego. Then we can speak about perfect and continuous and devoid of lack, devoid of dukkha. Then words start with a negativity cut through that bubble, introducing gaps, etc., injunctions, societal demands, laws, requirements for education, whatever, fit certain criteria, etc. This cuts through the idealistic perfection. But that which precluded, which pertained to actual, the real, or the drive, may have been successfully bound by the imaginary and the symbolic. The negativity has been adequately named by the name of the father, which introduced Locke. And in this case, we will be talking about the psychopathology. So phenomena would come as traumatic or as symptomatic as only as intrapsychic phenomena, only as phenomena whereby the name of the father is inadequate to bind dukkha, to bind the discord of the exigency pertaining to the real. So we are looking at how then particular subject's way to make sense, to create logic out of the images which are formed around the events, how it can be re-knotted so that the suffering stemming from the symptoms, where our symptoms, can be more bearable. So psychopathology can be worked with or through with by means of counseling, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. But actual pathology is different because the anxiety is quite real there. Yeah? Here there is also anxiety, but we say it's a secondary anxiety or signal anxiety. Here it is, well, actual anxiety or primal anxiety, whatever. Let's just name it anxiety. And this anxiety is way more overwhelming and real than that one. This one can be still bare because there is the remnant of the linguistic processing which maybe worked before but now doesn't, because there is always more drive erupts which causes psyche to reinforce its processing. Hence the demand for therapy will never diminish. Psychotherapists, psychologists will always be with work thanks to that particular structure. But the anxiety here is real because it has never entered symbolization. Here the real has entered symbolization, but that symbolization exhausted itself and became inadequate. This symbolization here on the level of actual pathology has not been symbolized at all. So here we're talking about real as such, yeah, the real of trauma. And probably this is a good time to start talking about real. So once again, to reiterate, these rings and consistency they engender are only the case for neurotic subjectivity, whereby Oedipal narrative functions and whereby psychopathology is present. For other subjectivities, there can also be, all subjectivities can manifest phenomena or symptoms pertaining, by the way, yeah, I should probably indicate it that this pertains to symptoms. Can also present symptoms which are pertaining to either psychopathology or actual pathology within any subjectivity. We'll look into autistic subjectivity and psychotic and perverted subjectivities to see how it is done, how it happens. On a general level, we say that in the beginning of sort of birthing of psychic reality, all phenomena are phenomena of actual pathology, because drive is only entering symbolization. If some of it hasn't entered symbolization and still persists, well, we have subjectivities which are more, any subjectivities, by the way, not only artistic or pervert or psychotic, neurotic as well. Any subjectivity can be in danger of hitting that spot of actual pathology. In fact, extreme physical and psychic exhaustion, shock, etc., drainage of the body can bring one to the verge of this actual pathology, whereby the drive is remanifest again, and it has to be symbolized, processed again, and that can be quite anxiety producing. Very well. So okay, before we dive into the real and what that entails, because that's what is important, particularly to me in this course of lectures, since embodiment of real is a thing I'm introducing. Before we dive into that, let's point out that the way to relink the knot, if it's undone, if name of the father is missing, is by synthome. Synthome. So we have symptom, which is that forms out of the knotting, out of the particular reality which comes into being, whereby images built around the events of encounter with sounds are given certain logic. That produces symptom, some kind of dis-ease within the psyche and consequently within the body as well, because two are interlinked inevitably. Mind and body are continuously interfacing with each other, and discord on the level of the psychic life will produce discord on the level of the body, which requires processing, of course. So that's the symptom. The synthome in Lacanian terminology, and maybe let's get into this now. The synthome is the term Lacan coined in order to come up with something that can be done, which is actually done all the time by anybody, because this is how we render this reality livable and durable. Synthome. Well, first let's put this in brackets. Sin, some kind of shortcoming, perhaps. Another play on words. In French, saint, homme, or holy man. Holy man. Which is the way how a subject creatively renders their symptoms. Let's write it down. Synthome. Creative rendering of symptoms. So symptoms are never exhausted, aren't they? The point of psychoanalytic treatment is not to get rid of symptoms, if you don't know. The point is how to relink them, reknot them, rework them. It results in some kind of symptomatic solution, so that they're more bearable, but they will never be gone, because the very structure and subjectivity engenders their being. The very psychic reality is that of symptoms, and that's of course dukkha, yeah? Dukkha, or lack. Something's lacking, something's not quite right. The world is not quite all right, I'm not quite all right, others are not quite all right, something is wrong. That's basically this structural subliminal sense of something is wrong on the level of the psyche. Dukkha, or sin, original sin if you like, or structural sin, one might say, after having examined this. It is inevitable. So in symptomatic creativity, one renders symptoms and takes responsibility for dukkha. Taking responsibility for dukkha. So this implies that the subject, say in the process of analysis or whatever else subject does, maybe art, maybe spiritual practice, subject actively searches for a solution which makes these particular symptoms endurable and livable. And this is what turns one into a holy man. Spiritual practice precisely does that. It works with symptom, yes, psychic reality, something is wrong, there is suffering. That's the first noble truth. Buddha starts with that, really. And if Buddha starts with that, maybe it makes sense to start with it, isn't it? However, in this case, Buddha is just a master signifier. Why? Because Buddha said so. Nonsense. So the symptoms in the case of neurotic subject are a praxis. A particular praxis that subject takes in order to creatively process render symptoms, thus making them livable. For a neurotic, it's a praxis which enables one to access the real of jouissance and traverse thereby the fundamental fantasy, thus leading one to non-neurosis. For psychosis, psychotic subject, symptomatic creativity is applied to restructure the symbolic or bring symbolic into being. I call it recreating the symbolic. Recreating the symbolic. So that's something that Lacan particularly alluded to in his studies of James Joyce. As you know, if you read Joyce, in his works, role of the father is kind of always put into question. Father doesn't carry the symbolic authority. It is a brutal or absent or emasculated in some ways or weak, and the subject doesn't rely on the father. So we can say that this is precisely the case for Joyce, that name of the father is foreclosed, perhaps. So Joyce comes up with the solution to that and makes oneself into artificer. Joyce, the great writer. So he identifies with this enormous idea of the great writer, enormous role which he assigns to himself, and sails onto the task to create literary masterpieces which countless critics will be searching and researching for generations to come, which he arguably succeeded in, and produces in recreating the entirety of language, the entirety of the symbolic order. And one only needs to look at Joyce's books, especially Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, to see how it's done. The language is played with, the Lacan is exercised with, the epiphanies are blossoming, and precisely the epiphanies are where unconscious is linked onto the real. Yeah. And so that pertains to symptomatic creativity in case of the psychosis. If you look more in detail how it is happening, why initial processing, then construction of the delusional metaphor, and further paranoiac and narrative. So Joyce is someone who is the initially psychotic subjectivity rendered one's life normal via his art, via his identity of a writer, and via his symptom, which is Joyce the great writer. So that's psychosis. How symptom functions is psychosis. In perversion, symptom functions on the level of systematic restraints upon jouissance, which substitutes name of the father, which is foreclosed, solely disallowed, and props up the law. Propping up of the law within the symbolic in order to put restraints upon jouissance. Again, symptomatic creativity in case of a pervert is precisely the system of laws, injunctions, and how the life is to be structured, how the practices pertaining to sexuality in particularly can be structured, which possibly alludes to sadomasochistic devices and key words which one is supposed to say when the influx of pleasure becomes too much, so that it stops. These particular keywords or signal words become that, and that pertains to symptomatic creativity within the perversion, which is again, as a good or bad, is just a solution which this particular subjectivity, whereby name of the father is partially foreclosed, hence only one stroke as opposed to two, partially foreclosed or disavowed, so not fully relied on. Hence, one has to rely on one's own creative solution to delineate, to delimit jouissance. Neurotic fully relies on the name of the father, and this gives us standard, so to speak, structure of the Borromean knot. Psychotic doesn't. Pervert relies only partially. And the autistic subjectivity doesn't rely at all, of course. But different from the psychotic subject, autistic subject not only doesn't rely on the name of the father, it doesn't rely on the unary trait either, which, as you remember from the lecture on the subject of the unconscious, is the marker of difference within the symbolic, which engenders difference within the signifier. If difference is foreclosed, which is the case for autism, well, obviously there is no capacity to access name of the father either, no capacity to affirm lack pertaining to the real, hence the real invades. So the autistic subject relies on different means of objects, using objects to delimit jouissance invading the body, and then the means of signs, which are the units of language different from signifiers, and we looked at how they are so when we in detail look at the autistic subjectivity. But symptomatic creativity comes for the autistic subject at the stage of hollowing out of the rim, and this is something again we'll look at. Hollowing out of the rim, autistic rim. Autistic construct a rim around their body, basically, alongside which the interaction with the other, by the way, the symbolic other is non-existent there. Autist doesn't rely on symbolic other to process the real of the drive. Neither do they rely actually on the imaginary other to process the real of the drive. Hence, we have this particular formula for the autistic subjectivity, yeah, as you remember. Subject in relation to the drive directly, not through the medium of object A. And they use linguistic sign as a tangible experiences, hence the autistic scheme in conduct, in order to, well, manage the invasion of jouissance, doesn't it? But hollowing out the rim stage is when the autistic sign language has developed to such an extent that it has formed into particular fields of interest, and the particular expertise within this field of interest has been achieved, so that there is enough sign language to sufficiently circumvent the real of the drive and gain access to certain desirousness, even though through the synthetic other, the other which has been built out of autistic creativity with their field of interest. But that's where synthome is located for the autistic subject, at the level of that rim around the subject starting to hollow out, starting to more and more sort of accept the otherness, so to speak. And to create it, well, autistics are very creative at that. This is in fact like a whole heroic deed of creativity, I would say. Okay, so this is synthome. Let us look at the real in detail, or in greater detail, and what the real stands for within this knotting, because that's fundamental. Real is from where all the structuration arises. And the real can be subdivided maybe on few categories, which we'll look in the following way. First, the real of dukkha. This is where we start. Real of dukkha. Fragmentation. The body is fragmented. It's not unified. Child's body is a mess. If you look at newborn infants, they don't know where is what, where is up, where is down, where are legs, where are the arms. It's all bubble, not quite coordinated, no motor coordination, no consistency. Why? Consistency hasn't yet come, because imaginary hasn't yet taken into the hasn't yet entered the picture. Inner intensities. Inner intensities, either pertaining to needs, biological needs, processes of metabolic exchange within the body. Maybe an infant has a gas, and that creates certain intensity which cannot yet be symbolized. The infant cannot say, oh, this is gas forming in my tummy. No, it's just a displeasure, just intensity. There is no even image yet for that. Hence, it's fundamentally dissatisfactory. Affect. And here we can already speak about, well, this is, Jesus. This one would say primal repression. And the level of affect comes when the linguistic processing has already occurred, so that which has been completely expelled at the outside. Remember that German word which I've been having issues articulating, Ausstoßung, is that initial expulsion. This dukkha is expelled, it's gone. It's so radically alienated away from that the subject that doesn't want even to go there. Hence, it always reaches for the other. Cry, baby cries. Why? In order to have this processed. Then, when it has been processed to a certain extent, affect of that which has been repressed, language creates the area of that which is incorporated and the area of that which is repressed, and the affect pertains to the area of that which is repressed. So affect is re-arising, causing invasion of jouissance. Invasion of jouissance. Which is again traumatic and dissatisfactory. Then we have displeasure due to lack of complete symbolization. Remember, the language can only capture partially the real. See? Most of the real is buried underneath. Sorry, most of the symbolic is buried underneath the real, from where it tries to grow through eating the real, but never fully, completely can devour that. All of that pertains to secondary repression, isn't it? Secondary repression. Then the real of dukkha, we also can have the area of, where we say, impermanence. Impermanence. We're all gonna die. Conditions of life change. Impermanence, which is change of living conditions. Aging. Sickness. And death. Aging, sickness, and death. That's the real of dukkha, yeah? Well, that of course pertains to the Dhamma. All of this is Dhamma basically, but this is Dhamma in a classical sense in which the Buddha taught. There is suffering. Why? Because conditions constantly change. Because of that, they're dissatisfactory. And ultimately, aging, sickness, and death are always upon us, or something to look forward to. And the reality is fundamentally dissatisfactory because of that. So that's what pertains to the real of dukkha: the drive, the consequences of its processing, and the inherent dissatisfactoriness and painfulness of life. So that's what we can say the real of dukkha. Then we need to in particularly look at the real of trauma. Trauma. As different from the structural trauma of initial encounter with the real of the drive. The real of trauma which is acquired is something which is quite acute, isn't it? So we can say acute. Oh my god, my writing perplexes me. Acute, shattering. Acute, shattering, and shocking. Shock-inducing. Shock-inducing. Exposure to real of dukkha. To dukkha. So what we have here, isn't it, the traumatic experience as such, being hurt, violence, being assaulted, or accidents having happened to one, which introduce one's soul in materiality and mortality, doesn't it? This duo, materiality and mortality of this life. When one is assaulted or accidents happen to one, this is what's come to the fore, and that's traumatic and that's real. However, on the subjective level, it's impossible. Impossible. So there is this argument within psychoanalytic theory, or this Lacanian formulation, that the real is impossible. Why? Well, because it cannot be symbolized, because it cannot be imagined, cannot be tapped into via discourse or via analytic practice. We only can sort of touch it, but never really enter it, because entering it is impossible. But the case with trauma is quite contrary, that impossible is real, or it does happen. Accidents happen. Death of loved ones happen. Assault happens. And that's real, and that's trauma. Of course, the acuteness and shattering and shock of this experience is such that it is too strong and too quick to abreact. To abreact and process. To abreact to process. The impact is too much for the current resources of the psychic apparatus to process. The real eruption is too much for symbolic to quickly eat it up. And because it shatters the imaginary consistency, this is why it is traumatic, and that is why it is impossible. It is perceived as impossible by the ideal ego, basically. However, it's quite real, isn't it? This is what, on another level, one would say that it introduces one to the Dhamma. Everything that is born is going to die, and of course in our ideal dreams and images of ourselves and how our life should unfold, we are not, I don't think any of us plans to die early or to be injured or mutilated early or wherever, whenever it happens, but it can happen anytime, and that's the Dhamma. Everything that is born will die, but nothing is said as per the time span of that as to when. Okay, that's another category of the real and where it occurs. So then we can speak of the real of unsymbolizable. Okay, and this is something that is that we encounter in the process of abreacting, in the process of processing, in the process of analysis. This is what in psychoanalytic experience is encountered in the symptoms, of course. Nucleus of the dream, or I should say of a dream, whatever. Nucleus of a dream. This is what Freud already discovered, that at certain moment where the association process, when undoing the dream, can any longer cannot proceed anymore, the subject hits the nucleus of a dream, whereby the dream is hitting the real at its core, and that's no longer symbolizable. That's where it stops. In this case, we would say that analysis hit a success and brought the subject to his or her or their real, which is good. This is how the reaction can be done safely, so real can be tapped into. In case of trauma, the real is the one is thrown into the real and immersed into it, drowned into it. Here we are kind of coming to water and touching it with a big toe to check how cold it is. Has an area of non-symbolizable, the woman. The woman, remember this signification within the symbolic, because, well, it doesn't really exist within the symbolic, hence unsymbolizable. There is no signifier in the symbolic for the woman. There is, of course, the real, which pertains to the woman, and yeah, well, that's precisely the real. Remember, the whole of the symbolic is structured in terms of master signifier, or referring back to master signifier. Hence, it's done in a phallic logic. The woman cannot be, due to absence of the phallus, cannot be articulated in the phallic logic. Hence, that is unsymbolizable. Oh, and this. The Borromean Knot. Lacan considered that writing in the real. Because the structure is definitely more than the sum of its parts. It's a congruent whole, quite alive. It itself, it is not a mode of symbolization. It captures something real of the being of a subject, of a human condition, of the condition of existing as a speaking being. And those two are dichotomous, they're opposite. Existence and being don't quite come into another. It's a continuous dialectic alongside the murder strip, remember? The real can be gradually processed by the symbolic, but not quite. And it never can satisfy the imaginary totality, which we identified with early in life. Hence, there is this constant sort of morphing discord on the level of the subjectivity. So we can say that the subjectivity in this sense is real, and as that they cannot be symbolized. Well, that's why we have endless stream of literary masterpieces and scientific theories and discoveries, and the amount of writing that human beings produced, if piled all together, will probably cover up the entire planet with paper. Why? Well, precisely because human condition is that. Pam param, unsymbolizable. Okay. Let's move on to something else pertaining to the real. Sorry. The real of unknowable, which is a bit different from symbolizable, isn't it? The real of unknowable has to do, well, the easiest example is the law of karma. Law of karma. Law of causality. Well, being a law is the element of the symbolic, obviously. But the real thing pertaining to karma, that one is reborn, isn't it? Rebirth. And carries the seeds of previous existences within, something that can be known. It cannot be known for sure, it cannot be proven, it cannot be researched scientifically, not really. Of course, there are stories, but stories are these. It's still unknowable. You can trust the story, you can believe the story, but you cannot know it directly, doesn't it? Can't you? Hence, that's the real of unknowable. That's something which cannot be known directly, and that's why it's real, or at least on the level of the psyche. Here, karma pertains precisely to the fact that the action has causes. As to how these causes manifest, it's not sure. Yeah. Well, we would say that the causality is unsure. And even Buddha said it's one of the unknowables, how and why and when causalities will manifest. It can be known post factum, when causality has manifested, but it is said that one forgets the previous existences, unless there are those rare cases whereby beings do remember their previous existences due to their mental development. Something else pertaining to the to this is the limit of knowledge. It is a continuous sort of dream of science to produce theory of everything, doesn't it? But there is a limit therein precisely because of the structure of our subjective experience. We can tap into symbolic, but symbolic can never circumscribe the real of that which is within, but that which is within is a reflection of that which is without. Hence, our knowledge has limits simply or precisely because of that, or at least our symbolic knowledge has limits. Arguably, there is the real knowledge, the knowledge of the enlightened ones. I could write it down, the real knowledge. But again, it's unknowable, isn't it? You cannot know for sure. Causes which lead to such knowledge are not sure. You have to be enlightened to know for sure. And even the enlightened would tell you why, you would still not know because it's not your experience. The Buddha, precisely due to these reasons, refused to teach on the topic of that which wasn't about how to stop suffering Remember the metaphor of handful of leaves, whereby Buddha holds a handful of leaves and asks the monks, what is greater, leaves in my hand or the leaves on the entire forest floor? Of course, the leaves on the entire forest floor. Well, that's the same with the knowledge which I have. I only teach that which pertains to liberation, but that all the other phenomena pertaining to the real of things, one might say das Ding, the thing, the Freudian thing, or the things as they are, maybe, is unknowable, or at least, and even if the enlightened being has not taught these things, the real pertaining to all the things, then maybe they are irrelevant as such to our subjective experience and what can be attained. And well, of course, from here we would say that the unknowable are the causalities of paranormal or supernormal abilities. Well, CD, or supernormal abilities, psychic abilities, supramundane knowledges are the thing, and the enlightened ones who have access to the real knowledge are said to possess those CDs. The Buddha himself has attained a number of CDs and manifested a number of CDs during his enlightenment and afterwards in his teaching career. They vary what can be done by location, projection into the different realm, control of matter without touching it, whatever. Ability to see the thoughts of others, ability to see the unfolding of events, etc. Ability to see the law of karma pertaining to individuals, even though it's unknowable, but in the case of CDs, it is said that it is knowable, but again, we cannot know for sure whether these abilities are a thing, whether they exist. Again, we can hear accounts, we can maybe even witness them, but the causality is too complex, too intricate for us to symbolize, to know it as the form of chain of signifiers which can be understood. Hence, they pertain to the real of unknowable. So, this is what pertains to the real of that which cannot be known. And maybe the last one in this classification, the real of transcendence. The real of transcendence. So what we have here, divine light. Divine light of Yuan Shen, or original spirit. I'm quite aware that we are outside the psychoanalytic realm already, but divine light of Yuan Shen is a thing, and it can be visually perceived, and it's real, to the extent that this is something not in any way near to this structuration. It arises despite, or except, or not having any reference to the imaginary totality that a subject possesses, nor the amount of knowledge that one amassed in the symbolic or has capacity to operate under. It just is. Yeah, it's tatam. Tatam. As such. And then the mind is purified of the real of dukkha. And oh yeah, by the way, this is what I have not touched on in the real of dukkha, which is, let's maybe delineate it here, mental defilements. Mental defilements. Greed, hatred, delusion. Greed, hatred, and delusion. Or the 5 hindrances, yeah, sensuality, ill will, lethargy, restlessness, and doubt. Nivarana, 5 hindrances, which constitute the spectrum of mental defilements pertaining to greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the carnal roots of real dukkha. Why is the displeasure as per the drive? Well, because we are born with this. We are born because of this, because if there was none of these, we wouldn't be born, at least in accordance with the Dhamma. Out of these, then the causality of 5 hindrances arises as well. But if that is absent, what arises is undiluted light of Yuan Shen, the divine light, the effulgence of the spirit. Hence, we have jhanic states as well. Jhanic states, whereby the Yuan Shen is accessed, and we say that temporary suppression of mental defilements occurs in these states. Or kilesa. Kilesa meaning mental defilement. So we say that in jhanic states, the hindrances are suppressed, the defilements are suppressed temporarily. Hence, the light of Yuan Shen can be witnessed. And further, we have attainment of cessation. Attainment of cessation, which is a more prolonged state of this suppression of mental defilements, whereby the mind stream of the particular practitioner enters the cessation of this, and cessation of dukkha as well. Why? Well, because mental defilements have ceased, and the flow of one's energy basically is unpolluted by anything. Because why is there displeasure in the first place? Well, because there are hindrances already there innately. We are born with them. We are lacking mindfulness. We are unable to relate mindfully to phenomena of distress. Hence, defilements arise and render this continuity of mental physical experiences as horrible or as displeasurable. In the attainment of cessation, all of that cancelled out, ceases. An attainment of cessation can last for days if the practitioner is skilled. But again, it's temporary. What is not temporary and what is lasting is when these roots of greed, hatred, and delusion are completely taken out, uprooted, gone. When the final realization is attained and one enters the deathless state, more commonly known as Nibbana. Nibbana, or Nirvana in pop terminology, but in Pali it's Nibbana. So all of that also pertains to the real, in my opinion, or in my view. Why? Well, because we say, or in ancient teachings, They say that we are harnessing reality, we are attending to reality directly when we have capacity to dwell in those states, when we put a stop of the activity of mental defilement and the activity of the acquired subjectivity, so that we enter the states which are genuinely, not traumatically, not disturbingly real. And these are the states of, well, states in which enlightened beings dwell. And this is what practice of embodiment of the real alludes to. Maybe let us see as to what we can hope to achieve with these different subcategories of the real. The real of dukkha. Dukkha. We seek to endure and understand. Endure and understand dukkha. Because we cannot yet completely eradicate it, we need to come to terms with it. We need to come to terms with the impermanence. We need to know it. When we can see it, know it, tolerate it, endure it, with finally accepting it, maybe, then we can let go. So dukkha needs to be understood, and the causes of dukkha need to be let go of. Before that, well, one needs to be able to just dwell with it. This is what training, mental training, training of endurance, patient endurance. Let's write it down. Kanti. Kanti. That's what mental endurance is about. Supreme incinerator of defilements, as Buddha said, is endurance. Patient endurance. So we endure the phenomena before we can let them go, because nothing just goes like that. You have to build up reserves, build up energy. Then we have the real of trauma. We seek to process it. We seek to process it. And here we definitely need some kind of therapeutic assistance. We maybe need a therapist, or maybe we need to engage in some artistic process, or maybe we need healing on the physical level if we've been traumatized in this way, so that the registers can relink again in some congruent way, so that the actual pathology is no longer acute for us. Because if that's so acute and the jin, the essence, are disturbed, well, there is no capacity to generate chi necessary for this process. Yeah. So trauma needs to be dealt with. The real of unsymbolizable. We need the praxis. And we need the synthome. Not that we need it. It's just the way how it can be dealt with, perhaps. So that which is unsymbolizable, the nucleus of the dreams and the symptoms and the limit of our knowledge, and the woman, lack of the signification for the femininity. Synthome needs to be built there where things are initially unsymbolized. So basically this is healing the psychopathology, isn't it? And this is healing actual pathology, the trauma. So we need to dress it and categorize it and maybe make some kind of art out of it and dance it out and analyze it and reanalyze it again and maybe write a poem and I don't know what else. The important point to recognize here is that you cannot not do it, because if you do not do it, you remain stuck, you will cause stagnation. This needs to be done, this needs to be processed, it needs to be either abreacted or somehow transformed, or conditions need to be made livable, durable. The real of unknowable. There is really no solution here. Maybe, well, enlightenment, I would say. Then you know, enlightenment. And the real of transcendence. Same. Spiritual practice. Spiritual practice. One needs to train the mind, the energetics, and ability to enter the states of cessation, the states whereby Yuan Shen, or the light of original spirit, may be perceived, and one may dwell in it. Dwell in it energizes the mind. Energized mind is capable to penetrate through the veil of delusion contained therein, isn't it? Maybe I should write it down. Structure of delusion. Structure of delusion, this is what it is. We come into the world without any capacity for being mindful. We are only a bubble of screaming, hungry intensities which seeks for holding, mirroring, naming, education, training in how to endure, how to bind that real. Perhaps the bubble seeks healing, which of course it does. We start with the actual pathology, don't we? That needs processing, some kind of artistic creativity, but all of that works with just basically the delusion, the incapacity to simply be there present it is. And that simply be there it is not as easy, isn't it? At ease is actually prerequisite for this. At ease. At ease. At ease can lead to, I don't know, cultivation, I would say. But in order to be at ease, endurance needs to be there, which leads to the acceptance and to letting go. Well, letting go completely would be this, isn't it? Yeah. But the condition for it must be at least minimal capacity to be at ease with it. And in order to be at ease with it, well, we need to symbolize it, we need to process it, we need to do something about the symptoms which create the psychic reality in the first place, so that we can access the drive. Because in normal neurotic reality, there is no access to the drive. It's all overshadowed by the symbolic imaginary proliferation of meaning, of law, of language, of concepts and ideas about oneself and others, about the world, about maybe theories are built and various other things are structured around. But that's still not the drive, it's a defense from the drive. Maybe desires are pursued. This is again defense from the drive. We need to attend to the drive directly so that we can face the mental defilements which render the experience of jouissance unbearable, and find the capacity to be at ease there. That there is at this level, we would say that we want to be at ease in the real, not at ease in our concepts, in our synthomes and all the other devices that we come up with to somehow endure. But we want to be at ease in the real, at the level of the drive and the level of maybe impossible. Of course, being at ease at the level of the trauma is maybe too much to ask. Something on this level maybe can do this, but the person who is still at the level of this, not quite. The trauma will still be shattering and self-destructive. So we again need to process it, need to find capacity to be at ease. Then we can attend to cultivation. So cultivation amounts to spiritual practice, which can lead us to the real in a genuine sense, the real which we seek to embody here in the course of this practice. So it is here that it is this real that we're talking about when we're talking about embodiment. Of real. Why embodiment? Well, because this origination of suffering, its cessation, and its cause need to be realized in this fathom lone body. At least this is what the Buddha said. And really, well, transcendence and its capacity kind of depend on this body to a certain extent, and the mind which exists in it. And the results of this practice need to be experientially realized, which again amounts to, well, embodying the results of cultivation, embodying the real. Okay, so that's enough for the structuration of subjectivity for today. Thank you.